If you want to talk about evil, look to Jacob. That's
I'm
going to be the
really,
tagline.
yeah.
If
I
there's
know a thing or
somebody
two
who,
about evil. That's true.
yep.
Uh,
So this is all from personal experience. That's what today's is going to be on.
well, it's also my 18th wedding anniversary, marriage
Today is.
anniversary. Today is, yeah. So I
Did you know
thought,
that
let's
yesterday was our, not you and but my wife and
oh,
my 15th? So we were
really,
married on, yeah, close. So did
you
you
know,
also know? I was hoping you would wear your T-shirt, but you were married on the feast of Saint Joan of Arc.
what?
Yeah, today is the
I,
feast of Saint Joan of Arc.
I'm gonna have to let Steph know that. It's just fitting. My punchline here is that it's fitting that we're going to be talking about evil today because I've been married for 18 years and I
The
know a
old,
thing or two
yeah.
about it. Yeah.
Yeah,
Womp
yeah, because
womp.
you're in prison.
Ah.
Welcome to the Voyage podcast, a show that traverses the oceans of myth and legend through the lens of Catholic theology and philosophy. Come aboard as we set sail in pursuit of the heroic life and Christian virtue, with your hosts, Mike Schramm and Jacob Platty.
Ironically, it's going to be a lot about cosmic duality too. We're going to be talking about
I was
villainy,
about to say,
but we're
when you
going to
had
be
the
doing
male and
cosmic
female,
duality. Yeah. So it's
according
like,
to Plato. So Jacob's got Plato brain too. So.
what better day to talk about cosmic duality than
Mm-hmm.
a wedding anniversary?
That's
Marriage anniversary.
that's where the Jerry Maguire "you complete me" phrase came from. They were talking about Plato,
That's
right? That's the that's what Renee Zellweger really meant. Is she wanted to talk more about Plato. Well,
it's a deeply philosophical movie, folks. Jerry Maguire,
yeah,
I'm telling you,
yeah.
it's very academic.
So if you have, if who could have picked this up by now, but if you haven't already, Jacob and I, we're going to talk a little bit about not even as general as evil as such, but more specifically the Sinister Six, which is a group of villains in the Spider-Verse, in the Spider-Man universe. And partially, and like I said, I was teasing Jacob because this is a little bit of a project of his, because you contributed a chapter to Spider-Man and Faith from Voyage Compass
What?
recently. Yeah.
What's this? What's this book, Spider-Man and Faith, you're talking about, Mike?
Okay, and cut to commercial. So, the Spider-Man and Faith, it's a project by Voyage
Now
Compass.
out from
See,
Voyage.
I've got my
Voyage
exactly. I got my
Publications.
advertising on.
Yeah.
So, and in it, it's a collection of, from different authors, different chapters about the various aspects of faith that you can find in all the different Spider-Man properties. So some of the chapters deal with, the Tobey Maguire trilogy, the film trilogy. Some of them deal with the Andrew Garfield, which will soon be a trilogy. I think there's going to be an Amazing Spider-Man 3 coming out soon. Some of them deal with the
There
Miles
is?
Morales.
I hadn't
thought they were
heard
going to
about
do. I
that.
thought they were going to complete. I think because of how popular he was in Far From Home, I thought they were going to come back around and
They
try to
should.
do that.
I would support that. I would support that 100%.
Some of them
He
are.
didn't get a fair shake.
Some of the chapters deal with the comics material from the comics, and then some of them deal with the Tom Holland Spider-Man, and I think I mentioned too, but the Miles Morales Spider-Verse movies as well, which also, even though it's not going to be anytime soon, unfortunately, but looking very much forward to the third chapter of that trilogy.
Yeah, that's going to be
also
sick. Those are
it's
great
going to be so
movies.
good.
Yeah.
Because Jacob remembers how much I loved the second one in our
Mike
conversation
loves
last
these
summer.
movies. I have
from
a
last
more
summer,
conflicted
so.
relationship with them, but I deeply enjoy them.
Jacob
they're
just
super...
rejects joy in his life. That's I think the takeaway. Remember, you're the one who's mired in the muck of evil, and so it's just hard for you to see the sunshine trying to make its way through.
Mike, sometimes you got to touch the darkness in order to understand. The
that's a
light
Rings of
something
Power
like
reference.
Yeah.
What are you doing? You're making Rings of Power references, like yeah. So and what? How many years has it been? Have we been friends for like what? A few years now. Not as many years as we've been married, but we've been friends for a few years. And
well, I mean,
it's one of the things
nice
that you come
think
to know.
of me as a friend, Mike. I wouldn't go so far as to say that
we've
myself.
We've been colleagues for about 2 years. We'll just say at least colleagues for 2 years.
Oh no! Yeah, get out. Dang.
You're cutting this out, right? I don't need to make a joke about your. Jacob is allergic to goodness too. He's allergic to commitment. That's why he won't refer to me as his friend.
I welcome. My cat came in and jumped up on my lap just now, and I was like, "Oh, great! I'll be like a Bond villain. It'll work right in. I'll just have a cat on my lap the whole time." But man, I started petting that cat, and it just like went right into my nose. I don't know. Maybe we'll keep it in. Maybe we won't, folks. We'll let the
Yeah.
audience decide what happens.
Yeah, it can be very cryptic and just show the one thing of maybe we'll keep it in. All right, so anyway, let's get started. You had some stuff you had a comparison that I thought was interesting between the villains of the DC universe, or specifically the Batman universe, and then the villains of Spider-Man, and that's kind of what informed you a little bit in your general when you started
Yeah,
kind of
well,
talking about this idea of the Sinister Six and villain or and evil and how it appears in Spider-Man.
yeah, I have a kind of a pet theory of mine that it's not very controversial, I don't think, though maybe some people might nitpick it. Um, I am a comic book nerd. I've grown up really enjoying superheroes and supervillains and all the stories and things like that. And everyone knows that the two best rogues galleries in the comic media, as such, is Batman's. He's number one. Sorry, folks, he's number one. He's got the best rogues gallery, but a
See
close
our
second.
Batman episode
Yes, it's
from
true.
years past.
A close second, though, would be Spider Man's Rogues Gallery. Spider Man also has a super awesome Rogues Gallery. And for whatever reasons, that we're actually going to get into some of these reasons, but these two different kind of like sets of villains mesh really, really well with their hero. And generally speaking, the strength of a good story is going to be between that conflict between the hero and the villain, right? Especially in the comic book medium and things like that. And so when you have this particularly engaging kind of relationship between the hero and the villains that he faces, that leads to popularity. I think one of the reasons why Batman and Spider-Man are so popular is because they have such a good cast of characters that form out their
Mhm.
stories, right?
Well, and I
Um,
think this is probably what's led to I would almost say like the abuse of this, which is that we almost root more for the villains now than sometimes we do, or we are more interested in the villains than we are the heroes. And it's because of the interaction or the playing off of each other that we've always looked for, or we've always recognized as, yeah, it creates good conflict, good story, all that stuff.
in the modern world, we do. There's a kind of breakdown where heroes and anti-heroes and villains and what's right and what's wrong and all that stuff. It starts to kind of like all gel together, kind of thing. And so the duality between good and evil is kind of getting murky, right? And
Mm.
so you get a lot of villains nowadays that are very sympathetic, and but a lot of that's good storytelling, of course, right? Um,
And
I
on the flip
start.
side, and heroes that are not sometimes sympathetic, right? Not even just
Mhm.
anti-heroes where it's like you like rooting for the bad boy, but almost, the quote unquote complicated superheroes or complicated heroes where you almost feel icky for rooting for him or her for whatever
We're
reason.
we're not going to talk about the boys, Mike. I mean,
Yeah,
I know how
not yet.
much I
Not
know
yet
how
anyway.
much you've been egging me on to get this episode of the boys in for
Jacob,
years
you
now.
realize that
For
when this
years.
episode releases, we'll have already released our episode on the boys.
Is that true? Oh
Yep.
shoot.
So you can make all the empty threats you want. You can make all the empty threats you want. But once
Dang
this
it.
comes out, faithful viewers will
Oh,
know
I guess
that
it's true.
that I've already won. So
My
anyway,
ploy. My ploy.
as you
Yeah.
were.
Anyway. Well, all right. So, like, I ruminate upon these subjects of heroes and villains and whatnot, and comicdom and stuff. And it occurred to me as I was pondering, these different rogues galleries that Batman and Spider-Man have, that there's an interesting. This is my theory now. This is Jacob's little pet theory that you can all tear apart if you want. But
You have to buy the book first, though. You have to buy Spider-Man in Faith if you're going to tear it apart. But anyway,
yeah, that's right. Only paid subscribers or only
yeah,
paid
get Jacob a cut
patron.
first.
Only
Yeah.
patrimony gets you into critiquing. You have to pay the 2 cents to get into the peanut gallery in order
Yeah.
to whatever. Anyway, the the so the Batman Rogues Gallery is famously, they're all kind of just like mirror versions of Batman, right? Batman is the protagonist, and all of his characters that come up against him are all reactive. They're all reactionary against Batman, right? And so that either means they're an inversion of Batman, like the Joker, right? So you have Batman, dark, brooding, but ultimately the good guy. And then you have Joker, whimsical and funny and comedic, but also super the bad guy, right? So
Well,
it's this
and
imitation inversion.
And where would this show up on sort of Carl Jung's wheel of archetypes? You've got Batman, who's sort of supposed to be the shadow self, and then the Joker, who's supposed to kind of be the trickster, right, character,
Sure.
which we've talked about in previous eepisodes too. But anyway, yeah.
Well,
So
and you
there's
can
that
just keep
inversion idea.
you can keep going down the list, right? Two-Face is kind of like a bad version of Batman's sense of justice, right? Or his
Mm.
relationship to the law. Catwoman is kind of like the feminine archetype to Batman's masculine archetype, there or an inversion of maybe like his social standing because he's the billionaire playboy and she's like a criminal that has to like
Well, and the
steal to
thief,
eat.
right? So
Right,
the thief and
right.
the billionaire, right? So there's the
Exactly.
yeah.
So it's all an inversion. This shouldn't be particularly shocking to anybody, really. Like, oh, so you're telling me that villains are a mere reflection of the good guys or whatever? It's like, yes, in fact they are.
Well, and
However,
this does, I mean, very quickly, and we might circle back to this at various points, but this does play off of a very good, like, the classical understanding of good's relationship to evil, as evil being a corruption of the good, not as
oh,
these two like
absolutely.
equal opposite forces, almost like a yin and yang thing, which I know you'll get into later. This is actually more of the Augustinian view
Hmm.
of the good precedes it, right? The good is the primary, and then something is considered evil because it has corrupted some aspect of the good, right? So
Right.
like you use Two-Face as like that's the corrupted sense of justice in Batman. Is what does it look like? It looks like something we'd see in Two-Face, which again, if you know that backstory, it's fitting because who was Harvey Dent? He was also a lawyer, so you have
Yeah.
that sense of
He was
justice there
DA.
too.
Yep.
It's that corruption, the corruption side. So, but anyway, go ahead.
It's obvious that Batman's Rogues Gallery is a dark inversion or a dark mirror of Batman, right? And you can say that with any superhero. Okay, we all get that. Lex Luthor is an inversion of Superman because he doesn't have like the natural strength of Superman, but he does have the brains that supposedly exceed Superman. So he's kind of like the other side, the brain versus brawn type thing, right? Um,
Mm,
when we talk about Spider-Man, though, one of the things that I think is interesting about him is I would argue that if Batman's Rogues Gallery, all of his villains are inversions of Batman, then I would say Spider Man is actually an inversion of his villains. Now,
mm,
these amount to something that's very similar and and can be a little bit like of are you splitting hairs? And I'll let people decide that. But when you look at who Spider-Man's villains are, they all come from the same wrong side of the tracks. And that Peter Parker, unlike Batman, who was born into wealth, who has resources, who has the innate physical drive and the competency, the Bruce Wayne Batman figure is peak human condition, like absolute in control of himself, right? That's just who he is as a persona. So when you have
mm,
all these broken people, all of his villains, all of his rogues, reacting to his like peak human perfection, right? In Spider-Man's
yeah,
case, it's the exact opposite. In fact, Spider-Man should be as villainous as any of his villains. And the only thing that's different between Spider-Man and his villains is that he basically had the nurturing household of his Aunt May and Uncle Ben
yeah.
to protect him from turning into the kind of thug that he probably should be because he has the same origin story or the same archetypal origin that all of his villains have.
Yeah.
So his villains, he is the inversion of his villains. Whereas in Batman's case, his villains are the inversion of Batman. And they're
It's
not quite the
almost
same thing.
yeah, it almost feels like it's much more it's supposed to be like emphasizing a lot more autonomy on the in the Spider-Man one as opposed to the Batman one where it's like, oh, it's our choices that make us much more than our circumstances. Um which and I mean not to like discount obviously that, the Batman stories are about making good choices and all that stuff, but
Mm,
it's more it's there it's not like you said, it's not this victim of circumstance where Bruce Wayne just happens to be born into the billionaire Wayne family and have all these resources or have all these opportunities, and everybody else just doesn't, right?
right.
And I think the newer Batman properties, I think, are trying to emphasize that or make that a lot clearer that you know there's this huge separation between and you even get that from the sense that Wayne Manor is outside of it's like on the outskirts of the city. It's like he's
Right.
separated from the darkness, as opposed to like you said, Spider-Man he's living just down the street from where this, from like Hell's Kitchen, where you've got
Yep.
like Kingpin running the show, or you've got
He is the
you know
poor
and,
orphan to Bruce Wayne's rich orphan.
yeah,
You know what I mean? Like
yeah,
he's famous. Like, all right, Spider-Man's character is luckless. He's always put upon. He's never in control. His life is always out of control. He comes from poverty. He is accidentally bitten and given superpowers. He kind of falls into it,
so yeah, he
and
doesn't even choose
yeah,
in
he
the
doesn't
same
get
way
to
that
choose
like
it. It
now
happens
you could
to
say
him.
that
He's the
like
victim
Bruce
of
Wayne
his
didn't get to choose
superpowers.
that his parents were killed, so in that sense he didn't have the choice, right? But he had to make the choice to kind of get out of the, well, I'm just going to kind of live this like almost nihilist life of just getting whatever I want and then one day I'll die. He
Mm.
did have to make the choice of like, I'm going to train myself, to overcome fear and all this stuff that is in
Well,
Batman
there
Begins and in all the Batman things.
and this whole conversation actually could become a contrasting and juxtaposition between Spider-Man and Batman, because there's interesting similarities too. In a lot of
Mhm.
ways, they're both orphans, obviously, and Spider-Man had Aunt May and Uncle Ben, and Batman had Alfred, right, to help
Mhm.
raise him a little bit. But they're different too, and so that would we could go all over
No, yeah,
the map when
let's get
it comes
into
to that.
the,
But like
well, and I really liked the general DC versus Marvel like kind of
there's an interesting,
s-
and so it
yeah.
raises the question. It's like, okay, so how come Batman, is there more to this nuance that I've just posited, that
Mhm.
Batman's rogues are an inversion of Batman and Spider-Man is an inversion of his rogues, right? And it really comes down to the different kind of foundations of the two comic book giants,
Yeah.
DC and Marvel. Okay, and it's because DC has been around for longer, about 30 years or so longer. Hey, I didn't study the history here, so I don't know exactly when like publication
Yeah.
houses, got
I'm not going to actually
got
you I'm
legalized,
not going to,
whatever.
yeah, so
But Marvel did come second, right, to DC. And so when you look at the nature of DC's comics, they start out by creating Superman and Batman. All of their heroes, the big pantheon of DC heroes, they're all from like the 30s, 40s, and 50s, right? Superman and Batman are 30s. Aquaman, Wonder Woman are 40s. And then the Silver Age, because there's Golden Age, the 40s era of Flash and Green Lantern, but the ones
mhm.
that really stuck and the ones that are like most beloved by everyone, they came out in the 50s. Okay, but like the 30, 40, like you're in that World War II era, American ascents golden age kind of thing,
Mhm.
and the superheroes reflect that. Okay,
Yeah.
and they're um, representatives of goodness. There's a reason why they get called pantheons, frankly, because
Yeah.
they really are. They kind of like godlike. They're mythic. The DC characters are more in a mythic mold, a mythological hero type setting
Yeah.
than Marvel's universe, right? Marvel starts producing comics in the 60s, all right? The time of social revolution and activism and, you know, let's just call it progressive correction of like the flaws in society and things like that, right? And the
Sure.
superhero comics that Marvel is producing in the 60s, they're not coming from this kind of golden age Americana. They're coming from a kind of like young, kind of fight the system type
Yeah.
mentality, right? And they're much
Well,
more
and
down to earth and feet of clay type heroes,
I did
you know?
think it was interesting you said, yeah, like in DC they formed the Justice League, which very much has that. Not only does it have a more kind of abstract feel in terms of you're talking about the virtue of justice, but it should be reminiscent of, that's what, like when Socrates was seeking the unknown God, he was seeking this almost like personification of justice itself. And so
Yeah,
you get that, like you said, mythical sort of element, whereas what Marvel forms the Avengers. And so
yeah. The main
and
superhero
that's
team
not
is the
on accident.
Avengers. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's not a coincidence. Like there's a reason why DC's heroes name themselves the Justice League, and not just they used to be the Justice League of America, right? Because we
Oh,
really
okay.
are in Americana territory here.
Yeah.
And there's also a reason why Captain America, the Avenger for Marvel, he's the only character that was actually created in the 40s. He was
Mm.
acquired. Marvel bought out the publication company that owned the rights to Captain America. So when he's fighting Nazis in the 40s, that was all of the moment, modern, timely comic strips. And then what Marvel did is they kind of retconned it so that he got frozen in time and then got brought back into the modern day when they acquired his character. And that's why that's also why Captain America is so folksy and so, Norman Rockwell and things like that, and why he doesn't necessarily fit the same archetypal mold
Well, and
that
that
the
was
rest
obviously
of
one of the huge conflicts in the first Avengers movie is they were trying to play off of Steve Rogers and
it makes
oh
for
my gosh,
great
Iron Man.
storytelling.
Tony Stark.
You know,
Yeah, no,
and
it was
he's
good.
such a
Yeah.
popular character because he does reflect. He's basically like you took a DC hero and plugged them into the Marvel universe. Yes, yes, yes. There's nuance to this, and both companies are, and we're talking in real broad strokes, and these are kind of vagaries. I acknowledge all that, but the broad strokes are there, right? And so this is my take on the DC Marvel line, and it's also why Spider-Man's villains tend to be like Spider-Man is a reflection of his villains, and Batman's villains are a reflection of him. It's because they come from a place where Batman's a god and like the broken humans are reflecting him, and Spider-Man's a broken human, just like the rest of the broken humans that become villains.
Well,
Right?
you wanted to get into the word sinister and
Yeah. Well, and
the
so ultimately, yeah, this has all been a little bit of foundation for what we really want to talk about, which is the inspiration being the Sinister Six. So Spider-Man's Rogues Gallery, right? And then the chapter that I end up writing for that
and you're
Spider-Man
going to
Faith
use
book
and you're
is-
going to use the title Sin-Ister 6, right? Because you got to put that in there. Like
All
who came up
right,
with that
all
genius title?
right.
Who came up with that genius title for the Spider-Man and Faith book? I mean, gosh, it's like it's
Man,
just so
it's just
it's
so good.
pithy, it's clever. Yeah. Anyway, as you were.
Well, let me point something out to you, Mike, and to our loyal audience here. One would assume that sinister, etymologically speaking, is it's sin, right? Like sinister comes from the word sin. Oh, sinister means bad because sin means bad, right? Little did I know, and I will share this information with you, like Prometheus bringing out his flames.
You know,
Like
that did not end well, but go ahead. It didn't end well with Prometheus at
yeah, I
least.
guess
But
you're
anyway,
right. All right. Like a
as you
young
were.
hero going out on a journey and bringing his boon back to the village.
All right.
So, okay, I get it.
Yeah.
Sinister actually comes from the Latin, just meaning on the left. It's the left, okay? And why it opens up this entire conversation about this very, very ancient way of perceiving reality as a dualistic reality. And how this is going to play into this conversation about superheroes and villains is the fact that they mirror each other, that they are inversions of each other and whatnot. That there's a dualism going on between the hero and the villain that is playing out, and that's what makes these stories so popular. But we have to get into we got spent a lot of time
Yeah.
talking about the heroes and villains. Now we got to spend a little bit of time talking about this
The-
ancient
the-
notion of duality.
The left and the right. Does the Bible have anything to say about this, Jacob?
Yeah, because this is so
like that setup?
universal. This is so monolithic that even Christ himself, it's almost as if it's rooted in a divine truth that's greater than creation, a logos, if you will.
Ah.
But yeah, so Christ in Matthew 25, he has that parable of the sheep and the goats that I think most people are going to be relatively familiar with, where he says, "Hey." I don't know if we want to like actually read the quote or if we just
No,
like
just
give the
give
gist.
it a
Yeah,
give a
but like when
paraphrase.
the Son of Man comes back in his glory, he's going to divide the nations, right? He's going to divide the peoples, and there's going to be some that go to his left and some that go to his right. And the people that go to his right are going to go on to glory and paradise and be with Christ and God. And the people on his left are going to be the sons of perdition. And so you have this right-left division at play here.
And as a left-hander, I always found this very offensive.
I know, and this is the part of the conversation where we're going to start offending lots of people, Mike, because we have
including Ned Flanders, by the way. So.
I know, I remember that episode too. Well, and the left-handed people. Let's just get into left-handed people. It's like
I know, we're
they're
untrustworthy.
ostracized. You know what I mean? Yeah, a left-handed. You can't trust a lefty. You're a bunch of weirdos, right? Because you use your left hand for stuff. Who does that? Villainous people do that, Mike.
Can't trust. Like I said, you can't trust it.
Did you know this will come into a conversation? You know where the word villain comes from? It has the same root as villager. So a
Okay.
villain was just an aristocratic term for like a yokel.
Okay, yeah. So
It
it's
was
like the plebs. It's like the
yeah,
elite and the plebs. But
exactly it.
so
Yeah. So if
it's a
you're a villain,
classist
you're
term.
uncouth. Yep, you're
Yeah.
uncouth. You're uneducated. You're untrustworthy. This is where villain comes from, and it plays
Gives
right
a little bit of
into
an
this
insight into
conversation. Yeah.
ancient feudalism, doesn't it?
Yes, it
Yeah.
does. Right. But we have this type of language. It's not just Jesus using this language, okay, folks? It's everybody, even you listener. We point at the camera. You listener. That was perfect. That worked out real well.
Yep. Uh-huh.
Um, when you say, "Hey, we got left behind," right? Right.
Mm.
I just said right because it's like you agree with me, don't you?
Right means
Right.
correct. Yeah.
Right means correct, doesn't it? Or right on, dude. um, and so like we still use right left language, and then there's a similar type of language where it's like in and out, right? Like either you're in or you're out, right? It's the same kind of it's a different kind of spatial reference, but we still use this kind of reference to either directionality or space around us to imply a kind of moral value. And I would actually be a little careful with the whole moral statement because it's more of like a value, but it's more like a quality.
Mm.
So there is morality does overlap with that Venn diagram. When you're talking about right and left as qualities, there is
Yeah.
there is a reason why Jesus talks about goats to the left and sheep to the right. He's using a moral duality
Well,
in
it's
that
the
moment.
moral association with metaphysics, which there's always like morals is it's downstream from metaphysics, but they're not. You can't equate the two. They're not the same, but you can see the associations, and so yeah, it makes for whether you're storytelling or parable telling or whatever. It's useful language.
Well,
But
and it's
anyway,
these associations. This is where people get really confused in the modern day. It's these associations, and the reason why I wanted to distinguish quality from value in this particular context is because it does kind of become important. Because ultimately, let's just use the yin and yang as an example. This is another kind of duality that is going to be really, really obvious to people. Have heard about the yin and yang symbol, right? Circle, white, and black, but there's a dot of white in the black, and there's a dot of black in the white, kind of thing.
mm,
This comes from China, and within the Chinese philosophy that birthed it, yin is the female or lunar element, and it represents darkness, the feminine, being passive, and also like earth, temporality,
mm,
right? Whereas the yang is the sun or the male, and it represents light, masculinity, activity as opposed to passivity, and
mm,
the heavens or spirituality, things like that, right? And I think that your
mm.
modern listener is going to sit there and be like, so you're
Is
telling
one
me
good
that,
and one
yeah,
bad? Yeah.
one of
Oh
these is
wait,
good. That sounds
darkness.
like one of these is good and one of these is bad. And then, moreover, you're going to get this idea that so you put the female in the bad bucket and you put the male in the good bucket,
Or even
right?
just the association of passivity, where it's like that's some would
In
argue, or
today's
a lot of people would say
context,
that's part of the
especially,
problem, is that you assume that one group of people are part of the passive, they should just be acted upon, and then the others should be the actors, should be the ones who exert themselves over everything. And
well,
that's
because
and
we
again,
have
that's the
this
toxic problematic part.
we have a bias. We have a bias in today's climate that says that if you're not active, then you're bad. And it
Mm.
represents a kind of it represents a kind of hyper masculinization of all things, which is ironic because it's championed by, I'll just say it's kind of championed by like feminist waves within our modern context, where like girls don't have to stay in the kitchen and make sandwiches. They can go be athletes. They can go
Well,
put on pants and be CEOs and things like that. But what has happened is that we're legit, and this is where it gets controversial. People are going
Well,
to get
and
offended
I
or
was gonna
whatever,
say
but like,
to give it maybe a little bit, like I'm not gonna give it legitimacy necessarily, but to maybe see where some could argue that this is the issue might be is that the active, right? Because even in a Western kind of philosophical or Christian tradition, we would say that God is not acted upon, God is not passive, God is the primarily act, right, or pure act. And
yeah,
so if you start associating the male with action or act, then it's like you're saying you're associating, one group with God and the other with creation who is acted upon or less godly. And that obviously then you start to see a sort of like inequality there, right? And that's where, like I said, if you're going to give like the most, we'll just say like charitable spin to it, or be like, well,
Oh
I'm
no,
trying to be
I'm super.
understanding.
Listen, I am the guy that believes this stuff, right? So I mean, like, just to put a face to it, I don't consider myself toxically masculine, though I suppose
Mm.
maybe there's a bunch of people who would call me toxically
No,
masculine.
I'm not saying
Um,
as if you didn't believe that aspect
mhm.
that I was describing. I'm saying that's where you might see some who would see it as problematic, is when you're saying, oh well,
Well,
you
it's
know,
because yeah,
yeah.
they've come to equate action with goodness,
And that, well, and
and
they
that's
only
that's
see God through the
unfortunate.
lens of
Yeah,
power. And so when you
right.
start saying, oh, one's associated more with God and the other, or creator, and the other one's associated more with creation, then it starts to become this power imbalance. And that's, arguably what's been a big problem for, yeah, I mean, what, the
Well, and
last,
we're going
well,
to, well, yeah, and
that's
it
where,
just
but that's
it
where these waters get so muddied. And I was just trying to kind of like see like, well, this is where, for one who would maybe have an issue with this kind of duality, like that's, yeah. But anyway,
I get it. I get it.
yeah.
I think that I would argue that it's unfortunate that we've come to fight for, um, again, ironically, like all these kind of quote unquote masculine traits as the quote unquote good ones, right?
Mhm.
I would argue that, like, in what we're going to talk about is how important they both are, and how important it is that we all have them, right? That we all have a cosmic masculine and a cosmic feminine element to our very nature. Like, I mean, at the physiological level, we have a bicameral mind, right? And
Mm.
what people are going to accuse me of is that I'm writing male and female onto these two halves, that I am projecting this type of thing onto the right is logos and order and activity and all that stuff, and like that's me projecting onto it.
Mhm.
I don't think that's accurate. I don't think that that's an accurate thing. I think that what confusion we have in modern society now is that people have lost the ability to properly perceive how these things work together, because it's a breakdown of duality. To deny that there's such a thing as light and darkness, right, is an obvious untruth. There is something called light. There is something called darkness. They are experienced differently. Okay, um, and then again, there is something called male. There is something called female. They are experienced differently. But like, there's this type of duality is this it's so cosmic in scope. I think that people take it for granted, and then they don't realize that breaking it down
Well,
when they
it's just
start to break it down.
it's a different set of assumptions, because you've got one which is kind of like the sort of pre-modern assumption that essence precedes existence, and that so we draw our understanding of masculinity and femininity from something that's already there. Or do you have the assumption of existentialism, which is kind of the modern postmodern assumption, which is that existence precedes essence, and that, like you said, if you're being accused of imposing something onto this thing or that thing, that's because you're sort of like creating what it is based off of, and like I said, whether it's through the lens of power is usually the case,
Yeah,
that I'm going to project this thing onto, I'm going to project maleness onto this thing because it has more power, and I'm going to project, femaleness onto this thing because it has less power, because then I can be more powerful. So that's
right.
the two kind of,
And
like I
that's
said,
and
the
that's
two
that's
assumptions that are basing this.
a great breakdown of, I think, a basic criticism of
Mm.
this type of thinking. This what I'm presenting to people. Um, you know, and it's beyond the pale of this conversation to kind of like lay out the entire argument here. I will say that um, it's more than just projection, and I'll give a really good example between like the male and the female duality. Okay,
Mm.
especially because nowadays that's a big conversation. It's a big conversation that there's
Yeah,
more
you're
than
going to get us
one.
canceled, but go
I
ahead.
know, yeah, and I people can disagree with me or agree with me, but there is
Can't be
something.
canceled if you're not that popular to begin with,
It's
right?
true, right? That's going to protect us. It's our anyway. But listen, like, you have the seed and you have the egg. All right, this this is just we have to be able to accept
It
this. We have to
it
be able to
precedes
accept,
sentience. It
yeah,
precedes
like
sentience. You
there
can't
is
like
that which is fertilized and that which fertilizes. Um, it, this is cosmic duality. Okay, again, I'm not projecting. Like, if you want to call it a different name than male and a different name than female, then do that. But there is something that acts and something that is acted upon. Okay, that's why every it all comes down to this, and it goes, it's deep into the myths. Like, that's why you have sky fathers and earth mothers. Okay,
mm,
like the sky rains on the earth and the earth gives forth fruit, right? So it's not even just humanity, it's all of life. All of life is this balance between that which acts upon and that which is acted upon, and how they come together to create life. Okay, and once you start with that foundation, you end up realizing that there's lots of dualities. And at the end of the day, you can sit there, because there's plenty of criticism of this, right? It's like, oh, well, like some cultures view the moon as masculine and the sun as feminine. And it's like, what do you say to that, Jacob? And it's like, okay, but they have a duality, don't they? Like, they're still positing a dualism, are they not? Because that is
mm.
100% universal. And then I would even go further and be like, and, okay, so the moon is masculine because it glows in the darkness.
So it still
And
has the same
it
principle,
still
that
has the
same
same
light
principle as the
giving.
sun. It's just that,
Yeah.
yeah, you're just. But the important thing for this conversation is to point out that duality is super baked into the very experience of reality itself, and it is the interplay between dualism that gives rise to pretty much not just everything, but also everything that's interesting. And so when you get bringing the conversation back into like the superhero idea, it's that duality and the interplay, right? The juxtaposition, the contrasting, but also the inverting that happens, where you'll have heroes that have an element of the villain in them, or you have
Mm.
villains that have an element of the hero in them, and you see how they bounce off each other. And this is ultimately the nature of all storytelling. This is the hero's journey. The hero's journey, like, in that sense, the villain of the hero's journey is the wilderness itself,
Mm.
and the hero is the protagonist, the good guy, right? But this type of having to go out and bring back
Well,
this.
and actually, just to really quickly, so that's because when we talk about these cultures, and even the word culture, like cultivate, it's bringing order into the chaos. So the hero is bringing reason or logos into the wild, into the
Yeah.
chaotic wilderness, and so that's the same duality, right? And like you said, the villain, quote unquote, is the wilderness itself because that's chaotic, and it takes the hero to order it, right? And so that's, and like I said, that's where the word culture or cultivate comes from,
Hmm.
is that same idea.
And it again, these are qualities. All right, it's not a value hierarchy. It
Hmm.
depends. I mean, I guess depends upon your perspective. Like, you might personally value emotion over logic. Let's say, right? But a man can personally value emotion more than logic, and vice versa. These aren't. It's not that all women are emotional, you know, instability, but the basic duality that tends to overlap in this massive Venn diagram of all different qualities of life. You
Hmm.
tend to see things that kind of clump together. So, like, activity is
Well,
is knowing, and
and I would,
inactivity or passivity is
the
unknowing,
word that's
right?
oftentimes used when you'll have represent like Christian representatives or Catholic psychologists talk about this is they'll and actually Pope John Paul II about 50 years ago when he started writing what's called the theology of the body, which was a collection of different short talks, which was then compiled and put together into a book. But it was on the nature of man and woman,
Hmm.
manhood and womanhood, and the word that's used as opposed to conflict is complementarity. And so it's this complementarity between
Yep.
these two things, whether it's logic and emotion, or um yeah, all the I can't, all the different examples
it's
you give,
it's
but like
unfortunate that we
it's
can't just like talk about it, because it sound like we've been trained to be super offended at duality, because part
mhm,
of what egalitarianism has done in the modern context is erase duality. It's erased
mhm,
complementarianism, but it's
mm,
worse than that. It's erased duality. So
Yeah.
now we can't talk in opposites or complements or
It
anything. We can only
the
talk like
assumption is
monolithically,
that the
you
assumption is
know.
that complementarity is just a ruse
Yeah.
for, pacifying the covering
Keeping
over
women in
the
the kitchen,
conflict that's
right?
there. Yeah. So you abolish complementarity, and so the only language left is conflict, and so there again, it's through the lens of power. Somebody has to win, right?
Well, and
Somebody
so
has to overcome the other.
I think that it's demonstrable, right? People might find this to be a controversial statement too. But when you look at history, yes, it's patriarchal. Yes, Western civilization especially is patriarchal, but really 99% of the world's cultures have been patriarchal too. The But to pretend that women had no power or no role in these societies is just to bias your opinion or your perspective towards what the men are doing as opposed to what the women are doing. In other words, it's a kind of female erasure to ignore the contribution of femininity, the feminine
Mm,
people to human
yep.
civilization just because they weren't named Julius Caesar and they weren't out there fighting Goths, right?
Hmm.
Like there's other ways that culture is influenced and determined, and it takes all kinds, folks. And it definitely takes two principles. It takes both poles of the duality, all right, to make procreation, to create, to cultivate, to civilize, right? And the feminine element is there all the way through. It's just that we pretend that the only element that matters, and I'm saying we as in all of like both whatever the men and the women that are arguing about these things, right? They
Mm,
all just default to masculine behavior as the only litmus for success. So even the feminist principles are all about these kind of like we want to be able to behave independent and all that stuff. And it in practice amounts to we want to be able to wear pants like men. We want to be able to have jobs like men. We want to be able to do things that men do. You're still reacting to the masculine,
yep. That's
you
still
know.
becoming the
The
primary
the, the
or the.
masculine is still the litmus. It's still the and so
Mm,
I would argue it's because it's cosmic. It's because
mm,
even if you're not deeply rooted in like the symbolism and the mythology and the religiosity even of these
mm.
principles, you end up with a superficial kind of like monad of there's no such thing as difference and we're all just
Yeah.
identical, and it's like, man, that's just not what reality is, folks. But people have been
This
anyway.
actually reminds me of there was a did you ever read A Wrinkle in Time by Madeline L'Engle? They come upon this. It's almost like a 1950s like Pleasantville like neighborhood planet of like all conformity where the kids are even all bouncing the ball at the same time. But it is like the sort of, and this is why a lot of times in stories where you have a sort of hive mind, it is kind of creepy. It's scary, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
Because of this, like you said, it's when you eliminate every single difference, even the
Yep.
most fundamental difference to not just human beings, but to all, not even just to mammals, but to all reality, right? When you eliminate the most fundamental difference, it becomes this almost like it becomes almost hellish.
Yeah.
And like I said, it reminded me of that scene of that kind of story, which I think and what's funny about that too is the main bad guy is just this huge brain, right? It's a brain that has eliminated, right? So you have the logos at the elimination of the pathos, right? Or
Hmm.
at the, so
Yeah.
it's like you have the
And
thinking
that
of the
becomes a real
elimination of
problem.
the feeling. And so I wonder if, and she's somebody who she talks in some of her nonfiction books, she has this sort of like cosmos into chaos kind of duality, or kind of the interplay between the two. And so that's actually kind of an interesting angle.
Well, are you
um
familiar with the work of Ian McGilchrist? Like,
Not off the top
so
of my head, no.
no, he's a neuroscientist, I believe, but he spent a lot of time working on the bicameral mind, the left and the right hemispheres, and what they do. And we all grew up believing that the left was logic and math, and the right was, and it controlled the left side of your body, right? And then the right was like art and poetry and emotion, and it controlled the left side of your body. And that's how I was raised. I don't remember, kind of, it was just in the zeitgeist, I guess, growing
Yeah.
up. But he's pointed out that both sides of the brain control all the body, right? But one
Mm.
side is focused on the left side is focused on the idiosyncratic and details and being able to like grab a pencil with your hand, being able to focus on grabbing a pencil. Whereas the
Mm.
right is all about like larger awareness. And so like I'm in the room, I want to grab a pencil. My left brain is helping me grab the pencil. My right brain is keeping me aware of the fact that I'm in a room and that I want that pencil so I can write a piece of paper with it.
Mm.
Right? Like and you need both those elements. But that
Yeah,
type of
it's like
duality,
it's the parts in the whole, right? Kind
right,
of
the
thing.
parts in the whole, it's 100% what he's talking
Yeah.
about. And that also what he thinks that nowadays, ironically enough, for all of the egalitarianism and the lack of hierarchy and the breakdown of the quote unquote patriarchy and things like that, is actually because we've become so logic dependent that we've lost sight of what is typically the feminine, the
Mm.
whole, the numinous, the 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 deep things of life. Right? We're so focused on what ultimately amounts to control, trying to
Mm.
grab the pencil, right? That we've become a society that only cares about power dynamics, and
Mm.
being able to control technology and things like that. And it permeates everything in our lives these days. And so check out Ian McGilchrist sometime. His stuff is fascinating, and it's
Yeah.
about that breakdown between logic and pathos, right?
Hmm.
Um, and how our brain is supposed to have both. But this is another example of how that cosmic duality is present even in our physiology, right?
Yeah. Oh,
Well,
it's presentient. That's the thing. Is like when you
yeah,
talk about, even if you want to give some semblance of sentience to plants, this is something that precedes like a fully grown plant, right? Even if
hmm
the
oh
plant
yeah,
itself,
that
you want to give
everything
that thinking properties.
that
This
same
is
basic activity, passivity, fertility, male, female,
mm.
you know, it's cosmic, folks.
but
It's
but
cosmic.
Jacob,
It's not
Jacob,
projection.
you wanted to talk about Spider-Man.
Yeah, I know. So anyway, how
So
does this relate back to Spider-Man? Right. So
okay,
Spider-Man,
and
in
and I should just give a fair. This is not. It's a short essay. It's not that long of a chapter you wrote.
yeah, if
It's
you
it's
go
only
read the
like
book, yeah,
yeah,
it's
it's only like 5 pages. So you're getting
and I
the
skip
what
all the
the annotated
controversial
version.
stuff we just
I
talked
was gonna
about.
say you get the annotated version in
Yeah,
the.
yeah.
But anyway, as you were.
But what makes Spider-Man cool in relation to his villains is that he's also from the left hand of things. He's also from the wrong side of the tracks. He's also a poor kid who is down on his luck and doesn't have all the answers. And he's not some ubermensch. He's just a put upon kid who's given great powers. All of his villains, give or take, obviously there's exceptions to all this, but like a lot of his villains, a lot of any comic book villain, is someone who has a problem, who has a grievance, who has an injustice in their life, and they're given power. They're given the
Mm.
opportunity to act upon that
And if you're
injustice.
referring to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, then that person they have a problem with is Tony Stark. But because he seems to be the
The
primary
catalyst,
agent
yeah.
that acts in the world, and every bad guy, or not every, but a lot of the bad guys, it's in some way. It's like a 6 degrees of Tony Stark,
And
because
it's,
they all have some.
again,
Yeah.
ironically, probably the most like Batman surrogate in the Marvel universe too. There's different
Mm.
people would take umbrage with what I just said, but he is a rich playboy who uses technology to fight villainy. Okay,
Yeah.
he did have his parents did die. There's a lot of correlations
His
between Iron
power
Man and
is
Batman.
external to him,
Yeah,
as opposed to somebody like Captain America, whose power is internal, and then
right.
Thor, whose power is internal. So anyway,
But then in the Marvel
so
Cinematic Universe, he takes
he's got
Spider-Man under his wing. In man, see, we could
yeah,
have a whole
it
like
all yep.
the Spider-Man, Batman, Iron. Anyway,
Yeah.
but like
So
let's
back to the
go through
Sinister
some of
Six.
these.
Yeah,
Yeah,
our
center,
specific
the left wing six, right?
the
Like
left wing six.
the I'm not trying to be political here. That's just
Oh my
what
gosh, I
sinister
wasn't even
means.
thinking that when you said it, and now I'm like,
I
oh
wasn't
god.
either. It's just after I said it, I was like, oh, that's kind of funny. But not to be confused with the Savage Six, right?
Mm.
Do confuse them with the Insidious Six, which is the name they changed it to for the cartoon in the '90s for some reason. For some reason, I thought Insidious made more sense for 9-year-olds than Sinister did.
Yeah,
I don't get it.
because
But
we all have that as part of our cultural
yeah,
lexicon.
when
We're all
I'm 9
saying,
years old, yes, I was using Insidious in my language. Maybe they were just trying to elevate the kids. But
yeah.
there's been lots of iterations of this crew, but the most famous and the original is Doc Ock, Craven, Vulture, Sandman, Electro, and Mysterio.
Mm.
So some heavy hitters
Which
in.
they've all been used except for Craven in the various movies as
Mhm.
well. So like Doc Ock, you have in Spider-Man 2 of the Tobey Maguire, and then he comes back obviously for Spider-Man No Way Home, which I
Yeah,
mean that incorporates all the multiverses. There is going to be a new Craven movie, which I don't think it'll
yeah, that's
come out
coming
this
out.
year now. I think it might be. It might have been pushed to next year. I'm not sure. Vulture came out in the first Tobey Maguire series or movie, and then Sandman is in Spider-Man 3 of the Tobey Maguire. Did I say
Yep,
Tobey Maguire? Vulture is Tom Holland. Vulture is in the first one
Vulture
with
is
Tom
Tom
Holland.
Holland. Yeah,
And then
Michael
Sandman
Keaton
is in,
doing a good job.
yep. And then Electro is in number 2 of Amazing Spider-Man.
Yeah.
And then Mysterio is in number 2 of Tom Holland, of the Tom Holland Spider-Man story with Jake Gyllenhaal. So
Well, you look at these characters, and they all, especially depending upon what story you're looking at. Like Sandman, for example. In the comics, he's a little blasé, but in the movie, they do a really good job. The third one with Tobey Maguire, they do a
yeah,
really good
with
job
Thomas
giving him
Hayden
a
Church
real,
playing
yeah.
him, yeah.
He does a great job in that movie, and he's tragic. He's a family
Mm.
man. He's just trying to protect his family. Again, this is an inversion of the Uncle Ben, Aunt May thing that Spider-Man's always worried about, whether it's his guilt over the loss of Uncle Ben or his attempt to protect those he loves, like Aunt May. Those same motives are driving Thomas Hayden Church's Sandman character.
Flint
And
Marco, I think is what
Flint
you're looking
Marco,
for.
right.
Yeah.
Um, so if you go through Spider-Man's villains, they're all coming from this wrong side of the tracks reality, this left-hand reality. Um,
Mm.
the difference being, Spider-Man has his Aunt May and Uncle Ben to raise him and give him a sense of great power from great responsibility coming with great power. I don't know if you ever heard that. I just made that up.
Yeah, no, that's clever. You should
Yeah,
put that
wasn't that
on
pretty
a,
good?
yeah,
Someone should put
yeah,
that in a book somewhere.
yeah.
Um, but it's his relationship with the generations that came before him. Ironically, the kind of like post World War II era kind of DC-esque, like just good old fashioned goodness, just like moral goodness and just doing the right thing. Um, that protects him from making bad choices and turning into a villain, because
Mm.
he has the exact same context for villainy that any of his villains have, right? He just chooses to do the right thing, or they choose
Well,
to do the
think
wrong
of
thing.
how many Spider-Man stories we've seen where the boss is really mean to him, and the person gets fired, or the boss is being unjust or greedy, and so the person loses his job or her job. Um, the family rejects them because of some maybe because of the thing that happened to them or because of their powers in some way, and so it's like he gets or the girl rejects the upcoming antagonist character. So it's like all the same justifications are there. We see in the
Yeah,
life of Peter Parker. It's just what's the thing that's keeping him on the right tracks, to use your language.
exactly. The other thing about Spider-Man and his villains is how they frequently they interchange all the time. I don't know what it is. It has something to do with the fact that I think that Marvel continuity is actually still one continuous continuity, which means that there's lots of, in order to explain away, unlike DC, and hey, I'm not favoring one or the other because they both have problems. DC keeps rebooting its universe because of
Mm.
continuity errors and issues and just rebooting. Marvel, just up until now, has refused to do that. So how they get out of explaining away contradictions or continuity errors, it's as always like it was a clone.
Different
It wasn't,
multiverse,
yeah, it was a
different
different thing. Well,
universe.
even the multiverse stuff, that's all really modern. Like that's all like
Mm.
basically the last like 10, 15 years. Um, it's always in continuity. Earth 616, it's people die and come back to life all the time. It's like, how did that happen? It's like, oh, that was actually an alien in disguise that you saw die. Or they always actually, like they explain away everything with basically cloning. It's always cloning, or imitation or contrivance or whatever, and it's kind of silly at this point. But rebooting your universe every 5 years also sucks, DC. So I don't know. Someone has to figure this out. But in Spider-Man's case, he gets replaced all the time. Like, particularly him, and it's his villains are always like taking over his persona. It's a thing, or his villains are imitations of him, like explicitly, like Venom, right? Like Venom looks like Venom because like the symbiotic Venom suit wants to look like Spider-Man, and so he looks like, just because it's an aesthetic preference by the symbiote to want to look like Spider-Man, right? And not maybe most famously, but like recently in the last 10 years or so, 15 years or so, there was a storyline where Dr. Octopus goes and takes over Spider-Man's body, actually, and becomes what he calls the superior Spider-Man. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because what you were just saying is like he makes choices that are different from his villains or whatever. We get a chance to see Doc Ock become Spider-Man. And what's interesting, when he becomes Spider-Man, he takes over his body, right? And the comic does a good job of saying that, like, you are your body. And so when he takes over his body, he gets all of his memories. And so he has all the positive motivations
A
of
little bit
Peter
of that
Parker.
Aristotelian hylomorphism in here too.
He actually wants to become a good guy because of his habitation of Peter Parker's body. All of those motivations transfer to Dr. Octopus. And so he's like, I'm going to become a good Spider-Man because Peter Parker sucked at being Spider-Man. And I'm going to be a better one. I'm going to be a superior one. And that entire story arc is about how he, being Peter Parker, literally does a worse job ultimately, not because of inefficiency. He actually brings all of his intelligence and technology to bear, and he becomes basically totalitarian, quasi-fascist, where like he's taking control, right? He wants control of reality, and so he's erasing the opportunity for crime to take place, but in turn turning New York City into a totalitarian kind of like wasteland that ultimately like crumbles under the weight of that type of like singular control, right? So he's well intentioned. He's not trying to be a villain, but his actions are villainous by default because it's always about trying to control.
It's done apart from love, which requires freedom. And so because it was done apart from that was the last kind of element, right? Is that even though, like you said, it was done with all motivation of justice or all motivation of even maybe even temperance or prudence, but because it lacked charity, that means that it was able to, or it decided it was necessary to take away freedom, and then ultimately it became, it crumbled on itself, or it collapsed in on itself.
And what's really interesting, this is a relatively, it's been at least, I don't know, at least 10 years, right? So I'm going to spoil it a little bit here. It is actually he learns love through like a female, like love interest, Doc Ock, Peter Parker. It is his love for this person that inspires him to give the body back to Peter Parker. Comic book logic, all right? Like sometimes you say sentences and it's like, it's a funny sentence. But he gives the body back to Peter Parker because he knows that his methods can't save the person that he loves. And so it's love itself, a new inspiring love
Grace
that convinces
broke in.
him. Grace broke
in.
That's right. That's how that plays out.
So yeah, and we see something similar. I mean, you talked a lot about Doc Ock as just the first example, and we've talked a little bit about Sandman too. But in these in the six of the Sinister Six, you've got Doc Ock with the corrupted mental gifts, or actually another term could be mental powers, right? So intelligence is a power of the intellect. Kraven the Hunter is the corrupted physical powers or physical gifts, and Vulture is corrupted technological gifts. Now you can start to see how there's this mirror to Spider-Man. Spider-Man already had the powers of the intellect, being the intelligence that he had. He gets the physical gifts from his ability to jump and cling to walls like a spider. He then in some versions, I know in the Tobey Maguire version, it's like part of his wrist, but in the other versions, he builds the web shooters. And so it's
Yep.
the
Well, and
technological gifts.
that's the most common authentic
Yeah.
Spider-Man is that he is a tech genius and he does build his webs. Yeah, he's a genius.
Yeah.
Spider-Man, Peter Parker, tech savvy.
And so so Vulture, again, you have the technological gifts, but it's corrupted in Vulture. In Spider-Man, you have the family attachment of Aunt May and Uncle Ben, and in Sandman, it's the corrupted family attachment because, not that his relationship with his daughter is bad, it's that he is the motivation, which is good,
He makes bad
helping his
choices
daughter,
in order.
making the bad choices.
Right.
Electro, it's you could say like the social relationships. So I kind of talked a little bit before about how, like, Peter Parker is abused by his boss, just like I can't remember the Electro's like real name or alter ego name, but he was abused by his boss at least in the Andrew Garfield movie, Amazing Spider-Man 2.
Yeah.
It's because of his mistreatment, right? His corrupted social relationships. And I mean, he's got like you gotta get the sense of like he's an outcast. He doesn't have friends. He's not an important person. And then same thing with Mysterio. So maybe Mysterio is more
Well, what I would say
the
about Mysterio, here's the thing about Mysterio. Mysterio is got a superhero complex. So Mysterio wants to be a hero for the sake
it's
of like accolades and all that
it's like
things.
a corrupted magnanimity, right?
His
He has that bigness
corruption,
of soul.
yeah,
Yeah.
his corruption is, yeah, he wants the fame, he wants the accolades, he wants to be a hero, whereas
Mhm.
Parker doesn't. Parker doesn't want to be a hero. Half the time, he's trying to give up being a hero because
He wants to be
it's such a
honored like a
problem.
hero without being a hero. Wants to be
Right,
honored like a hero
Mysterio is,
without
yeah.
being one. Yeah.
So it's a false sense of authority, like moral authority.
Or
with Mysterio.
magnanimity is the
Yeah.
virtue that Aristotle would call it too. The bigness
Sure.
of soul, basically.
Exactly. Yeah, it's fake, because he's Mysterio and he's all about projection, right? Like he's all about
Well, and
faking
isn't
it.
in one of the version he's like a special effects, like he works in
In the
Hollywood
movie,
as,
he
like, a
was,
special-
yeah. And I can't remember. Is he?
The Jake Gyllenhaal one, he was like developing something for Tony Stark of like the
Yeah,
cognitive memories thing, remember?
that's true.
And he was
Yeah, you're right
he was
about
all
that.
butthurt that
And you're right.
Robert Downey
Yes,
Jr. called
in
it,
the at least I'll say this much. At least in the '90s cartoon, I'm pretty
Mhm.
sure that he is just like a special effects guy.
And I think
Like,
that's more like
and
probably
that's
closer
probably
to the
rooted.
I
Yeah,
think they were probably just trying to bring it like in more continuity with the other movies by having him be like
no
working
doubt.
for Tony Stark.
And it makes
all
more
that stuff.
sense because, I mean, hey, more power to all the special effects gurus in Hollywood. But the technology that Jake Gyllenhaal's character Mysterio is doing is
Yeah.
a little bit bigger than being able to digitally map a dinosaur into a landscape. No offense, folks. Hey, you guys, I like your movies. Good job. But yeah, Mysterio, he's more like weaponized technology kind of thing. Whereas he is just kind of he's more of like he's a magician. Or he's basically like a villainous magician in the more traditional representations of Mysterio. But yeah, he wants so when you go through these 6 things, whether it's the abuse of intelligence with Dr. Octopus, Kraven the Hunter is an interesting case because he's like a peak human condition type guy, and Spider-Man didn't earn his peak physicality, and then he's an avatar for an animal of sorts, a spider, right? Kraven is a hunt, so it's almost like the inversion of like the human dominion of the planet, the
Yeah.
human control of.
You could say it's
the
go back
animal
to your
kingdom.
original thing of the duality where it's like he's the man who's supposed to bring order to nature, but he's doing
Yeah.
it in this, to keep using this language in this toxic way, right? I mean, that's the
Sure.
like it's the abuse of that power.
Kraven
of
the Hunter.
Logos.
It's
the abuse of the power of the Logos, I think.
Not the guy that typically uses toxic masculinity in general. I think it's an abused term, but Kraven the Hunter is toxic.
There you
Kraven
go.
the Hunter is toxic. I'll give you that. I will give you that. Kraven the Hunter is toxic masculinity. Fair enough. Fair enough when it comes to Kraven the Hunter.
Poster boy for So from now on, whenever you see that used in like some news article, you're gonna be like, wait, are they talking about Kraven the Hunter? Like that should be your response from now on. Is I can only assume you mean Kraven the Hunter.
Yes.
Like, what?
who is also a Russian oligarch. So that just works really well for our modern
Gosh, yeah,
zeitgeist.
that's the narrative right there.
That's the narrative. Perfect. We can all agree that Russian oligarchs are toxically masculine.
Oh boy, now we're gonna get attacked from a different.
No, the Russians are gonna get us. Oh man, our most controversial episode yet. Did you realize that this was gonna be when you came into work today? That this was gonna be.
I had no idea. And
the most hot take. Yeah. Well, like and subscribe and don't
buy the book.
Buy the book. What
Voyage
a great
Comics.
book. You can
shop.voyagecomics.com. Right? I did a little bit. Yeah.
Mike has a thing too. Not that I read it.
No, we might do another episode on one of those too. I like the ones. I'm just trying to fill you up on that.
Thanks for listening to Voyage Podcast. The Voyage Podcast is a production of Voyage Comics and Publishing, which seeks to create exceptional entertainment informed by Catholic values that inspire people to live a heroic life. Voyage Comics seeks to advance truth and beauty found in powerful stories. To learn more, visit voyagecomics.com. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.